Now we would like to begin the second session. First of all, former president of the ADB, Mr. Nakao. And the panelists from 6 countries will continue to be the panelists.
So many panelists who are familiar with English more than Japanese. So I hope that the interpreter, translator can make this English good Japanese also. So I was asked by Mr. Kudo to make this kind of opening remarks for this session just yesterday. So I'm not so organized, but I'd like to touch upon issues which were also discussed in the previous session because I didn't have a chance to speak on that session. So this session is about American presidency and the impact of that kind of things, but I'd like to touch upon, start from the issues I wonder what are the issues we should talk today. So as a general observation, I think the world community is faced with the different challenges. The first is the inequality, or I would like to say the globalization and advancement of technologies, which are much speedier than many people can absorb. So globalization happens in terms of financial flow, trade, patent, and the migrations of the people and other factors. And it's much more than we could absorb. It is, of course, a fourth industrial revolution, but compared to the time of first industrial revolution, maybe it took one generation to catch up the technology changes for our life. But today, it is more like 2, 3, 4 years. The second point is globalization, the technology advancement happen together. That is the first point. The second point is because of that, there are so many resentment or the frustrations in the general public in countries. So many people say we should avoid populism. We should stick to the multilateral trade orders and freedom of flow of people or migrants. But for ordinary people who stay there for life, for generations, it's not so easy. So one of the problem is that, basic problem is that elites in countries can gain from this globalized world and with the technologies, but often factory workers, miners in the US and others, especially in developed countries, they are worse off at best. That is the second point. And the third point is, even though we are talking about global community and the international order, we are still in the sovereign states, and we should admit it. Because in the end, governance is provided by taxpayers and the voters, electorate. And if we look at the Turkish empire or empires of the previous centuries, there was no so much issue like social welfare or public education or taxation. Of course, there was a taxation, but it was much more limited. So today, welfare is provided by the sovereign states, and taxpayers should assume the burden of it. So it's not so easy to merge these different countries. And the fourth point I would like to mention is the weakness of media and other fundamentals or kind of a basis of a democracy and a liberal order. And media is now becoming weaker. I'm sorry to say this in this Nikkei paper whole, but generally speaking, because of social media and others, the influence of intellectuals, professors, and media writers, they are now weaker. So in a sense, they are paid less, in other words. So this kind of community like think tank and media and professors, we should try harder to, in a sense, keep, not raise, but keep the influence of intellectual professional ideas. And fifth element I'd like to touch upon is if I visited many countries. ADB, Asian Development Bank, has 6 58 member countries and 49 members in the region, including Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, which never borrowed from ADB. But anyway, I visited many countries, and still there are many countries which are still developing, which still want to become stronger in terms of independence from the influence of powers in the world. They fought with the colonizing powers even after the war. Dutch didn't give up Indonesia. France didn't give up Vietnam. So there was a very strong sense of independence, and they don't want to be intervened. And India is not the exception. And there are still difficult issues between former British Empire of India, between Pakistan and India. So those elements cannot be neglected. Russia also has a strong feeling of a kind of independence, no interference from the greater powers like America. And still, there are so many global issues like climate change, pollutions, including plastic pollutions, and also there were so many financial crises because of free flow of the finance. There are more frequent financial crises in the world. We should face these things. And also disease. We already discussed much about coronavirus. And there is also important issues to have international institutions. It is about taxation. It is about patent issues, intellectual property, and also data. Someone already talked about data and the trade system, which is based on the WTO, but there are more multilateral or group of countries with a trade framework like TPP. So these are background. By the way, I'd like to mention one thing, which is responding to some panelists who spoke, who asked what was the position of Japan's about the Asian community. And I think people often forget how seriously Japan tried to make these regions more united. And the ADB, Asian Development Bank, is one of the examples, and it was established in 1966. And it was 1 year before ASEAN was established. And Japan made a serious efforts to, in a sense, to enhance prosperities and peace by having such a system like ADB or ASEAN Plus 3 or East Asian Summit. And Japan provided a lot of finance, ODA, to Asian countries, including China and Korea. China, after Peace Treaty of 1978, and Korea after Basic Treaty of 1966. So I would say, and also massive foreign direct investment in 1980s, which in a sense promoted the chain, global value chains or production network in Asia, which in a sense makes Asia more united in terms of economy and investment, and also global change, value chains, which is totally different from flying geese model of the past. So that's what I really want to mention. And still, Japan makes efforts of being together with China and Korea in many ways, although there are many difficult issues, and to make a little bit different stance from the US or from the China. Of course, Japan is in alliance with the United States, and I think it is really important. So please think about the world where Japan doesn't exist. There is no such Asian kind of supply chain, and the US influence in Asia is much more limited. So I would say Japan makes a really serious influence on the unity of Asia, and I think it is still valid. So I'd like to propose several questions which can be discussed. Of course, we can go beyond. But how do we see the democracy and liberal order? And I think many countries still have a very strong sense of keeping democracy. People want democracy anyway. I visited Indonesia, Philippines. I was in Philippines and visited other countries. They really want freedom of speech and democracy, no alternative. But what is the role of sovereign countries? As I said, there are so many resentment, frustrations about equalities and so on. And the second point is a multilateral system. What should we do about multilateral system? I don't think multilateral system can prevail over sovereign system. Multilateral system should be based on the power of a sovereign, which should be strong. So, but how can we improve a multilateral system? And the third point is, how about the connectivity in economic arena? So if there are some dispute like this between the US and China, is it the starting point of totally division, or it's just a kind of hiccup or some adjustment, which is about the fair trade, about how to deal with the patent issues between two countries, whether there is a kind of a level playing field in terms of academic gain between China and the US. So what will happen to the global economic connectivity? And fourth point is about China. What is the purpose of China? What is the aim of China? So in my view, China has so many aspects. One is that they want to keep a communist party system. The second is they want to be more influential in the global community. It's not just to take the benefit, but it is a national pride. And also it is related to the feeling of no interference from others, because they suffered from colonization and also influence from other powers during these 150 years after Opium War. So we should also understand it. But they also want to play an important role in the community, in the global community, in climate change and regional corporations and others. AIIB and the Belt and Road Initiative, of course there are many issues about it, but at least they want to be more influential and they want to be a part of climate change and other issues. But at the same time, they are a little bit more assertive, expansionist kind of attitude is causing trouble. But what is the final aim of China? What kind of country can it be? And finally, then I'll go to this question which I was asked to make. And what is presidency of the United States? And whether President Trump has a very particular extraordinary presidency, or this move toward more isolationist attitude, more confrontational attitude, more America First attitude will continue to play a role. I would say America First is not so problematic in its own, because any country must make efforts to benefit the interest of voters and the electorate of the country. But to do that, we need the international cooperation to maximize interest of the people. But what kind of political kind of a scenario after this election and who will win, and it's more difficult to say. But anyway, that's my first remark. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. In this session, we would like to discuss the desired international order, and we would like to discuss that in conjunction with the U.S. presidential election. And to shape a desired international order, what should we do? I would like to ask two more people to make opening remarks. Dr. Lindsay, please.
Thank you very much, Kudo-san. I believe my charge is to talk about the U.S. presidential election and international order. And I think I want to begin with the international order and end up closing by talking about the U.S. presidential election. I really want to make 3 points. And my first one would be that the international order, or the rules-based order, or the American-led order has been eroding, and it's been eroding for quite some time. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind. And I think it's important to understand the reasons why the order has been eroding, because it will help explain why it is difficult to either reinvigorate that order or to shore it up. I will note that one of the main reasons the current order is in trouble is precisely because it succeeded. and that's one of its great paradoxes. The order suggested that if people opened up their economies, followed the rules, they will prosper. That is exactly what happened. It unleashed globalization, which raised standard of living in many countries. We often talk about how many people were raised out of poverty in India and in China. The problem is that globalization also unleashed a whole host of new problems that national governments and international organizations couldn't handle. I think climate change would be top of the list of issues that no one thought about 50 years ago, but now dominate the international conversation. At the same time, globalization dispersed economic and political power, making it harder to forge solutions. That may be most obvious at the World Trade Organization, which is slightly over 25 years old, but it has struggled over the last 2 decades to make any progress on multilateral trade agreements. Second reason the international order is eroding is because many countries have been ambivalent about it. Some countries, like Russia, have long resisted it, seeing it as antithetical to their interests. Others, and here I think China stands out, have seen the order primarily as a way to grow their economy, and not something that they had a fundamental commitment to, certainly in terms of its values of openness. I note that President Xi Jinping has said that China wants to help write the rules of the game, but he's gone even farther by saying he actually wants to construct the playgrounds on which the games are played, and I think that is telling. I think third thing that has contributed to the erosion of the order has been the misjudgments and missteps of U.S. foreign policy. I think most notably with the U.S. invasion of Iraq in the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. Policy choices made in Washington that I think raised, for obvious reasons, doubts elsewhere around the world about the wisdom of U.S. leaders and the relevance and appropriateness of their policies. Most recently, I think the order has been stressed by President Trump and his presidency. That is really the thrust of America First, which argues that that international order that the United States championed after the end of World War II actually impoverished the United States. He called it an American carnage in his inaugural address. That leads to my second point, which is that President Trump's turn to a more nationalist, more transactional foreign policy is a choice. It is not a political necessity. America First reflects President Trump's deeply held, long-held view that the existing world order was designed to enable America's friends and allies to steal U.S. jobs while free-riding on U.S. security guarantees. He actually took out a full-page ad in the New York Times back in September of 1987 to make just that case. In many ways, it reads like a rough draft for his foreign policy platform in 2016. I think fundamental to President Trump's worldview is a hostility to multilateralism and a belief that because the United States has the world's largest economy, it will get the most, certainly more than it currently has, if it pursues bilateral policies where it can throw its weight around. Now, it's certainly the case that there are Americans who share that perspective. However, they are far from a majority of the American public. Indeed, if you look at public opinion polls of what Americans think about foreign policy over the last several years, what is most striking in those results is how the American public essentially has moved away from America First. I will note that in the most basic question, approval of the president's handling of foreign policy, the president fares even worse on that question than he does on his overall public approval, which has generally over the course of his term been under 50%. Support for trade deals is actually up under President Trump. Support for doing more on climate change is up under President Trump. Supporting allies, defending allies, again, support is up. And indeed, on the basic question of should America be engaged in the world, what pollsters show time and time again is Americans want to be engaged. They're not looking to return home to America. That said, and this is a critical point to keep in mind, elections in the United States are not decided by foreign policy. The outcome of U.S. elections may have profound consequences for U.S. foreign policy. Think of the transition from Jimmy Carter to Ronald Reagan, or from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush, or Barack Obama to Donald Trump. But Americans seldom vote on foreign policy. They vote on domestic issues, and to an increasing degree in the United States, they vote on the basis of partisanship. That is, they'll vote for their party's candidate regardless of what the person's actual particular views are. I flag all this so I can make my third point, which is that however the 2020 U.S. presidential election turns out, reinvigorating the existing world order is going to remain very difficult. Now, I want to be very clear here. Kudo-san wants me to tell him who is going to win in November. I don't know, and I'm not going to make a prediction here. I will note that if President Trump wins, and let me remind everybody that 4 of the last 5 presidents who sought re-election won, then I think you're going to see current trends continue. President Trump does not see his mission as rescuing or reinvigorating the international order. I will also note that in the face of a second Trump term, I don't expect U.S. allies to suddenly become more effective than they have been during the first Trump term at repairing the international order. Indeed, I think you will see even greater paralysis in many allied capitals in the further erosion of the international order. By the same token, however, I think it would be a mistake to assume that if a Democrat wins on December 3rd, that Washington will suddenly ride to the rescue of the international order. First, let me just point this out. If a Democrat does win on November 3rd, he or she is going to have a long list of domestic issues that he or she is going to focus on. That's understandable because that's why they will have been elected, to tackle those big domestic issues. Second, as I tried to express in my opening of my remarks, the ills of the international order are actually broad and they are deep and they won't be easily repaired. Much of President Obama's foreign policy can be thought of as an attempt to put the international order on a more sustainable footing. I think it's fair to say he had at best limited results from that effort. I will note that no consensus exists in the United States on how to repair the international order, what issues should be the priority, just as I don't think there is a consensus internationally, even among Western allies, if I can use that phrase, on the question of how to fix the order. And I think forging a consensus will be difficult and time-consuming, and I have to admit, perhaps even beyond reach. Finally, let me just note that the political, economic, and diplomatic tensions between the United States and China will persist even with a Democrat in the White House. I think it's very important to emphasize that Democratic candidates share with President Trump his basic diagnosis that the United States needs to stand up to China. Having said that, they don't necessarily endorse his strategy. In fact, most of them would argue that his strategy of not working with America's friends and allies virtually guarantees a failure of the legitimate objectives he seeks. What that means is that if you have a Democratic president, he or she will actually be more inclined to try to build a global coalition to work with others. But I will note that that contains a danger for countries like Japan. They will no longer have the luxury of complaining about the United States not doing the right thing. Instead, Washington is going to come knocking on the door, asking for help, and asking for countries to put skin in the game and decide what it is they're willing to try to achieve and how much they are willing to pay for it. And I would imagine, I don't in any way want to single Japan out in this score, but certainly for a number of America's friends and allies, that is going to require making some very painful decisions domestically in particular. One other thing, and I want to leave everyone on this because I worry a bit about sort of the framing we had in the last session talking about the U.S.-China confrontation. I don't think most Americans see themselves as being engaged in a confrontation with China. But rather what I see many Americans, Republicans and Democrats included, as seeing themselves engaged in an effort to hold China to account. That if China wants to participate in the benefits of this liberal, rules-based, American-led order, the Chinese have to live up to their commitments. And I think for Americans across the political spectrum would argue, and I think they would have considerable evidence on their side, that China, for at least a decade, has deviated away from the course it signed up to and pledged to in the early 2000s. And I will note there's a tendency to talk about engaging versus picking a fight. I do think it is important to engage China. I think Democratic candidates would argue they are engaging. I think President Trump would argue that he is engaging with China. But it's equally important, if you wish to get China to change its behavior, to be able to point out areas in which you think China has come up short and demand change. There's no indication that Beijing is willing to simply give away benefits it has because somebody asked nicely. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much. One more person will be appearing on a video from Chatham House. Dr. Robin is also not be here, able to join us here, so he has a video message.
I think it's incredibly important that the Tokyo conference is focused this year on the theme of liberal international order. It is the topic that is occupying the world, the Western world certainly. My sense is that systems of accountable and inclusive governance are the bedrock for long-term international cooperation. We know that there are many different political systems alive in the world today. We've managed over the last 70 years to build a globalized economy around those different political systems, some of which are liberal and democratic, some of which are authoritarian or have centralized non-democratic forms of control. And I recognize that. But we must also recognize that we have very different political systems trying to work towards those common interests. And I am a big believer that we need to find ways not to end up in a new Cold War, a new economic Cold War, where the two systems are split, the liberal and the non-liberal, because we will not be able to confront our common challenges if we are split. But I have to recognize that today, in 2020, we are in a time internationally where two systems of government are trying to coexist. I do believe that in that moment, our job as think tanks, I'll speak for myself, our job as Chatham House, is to make sure that the divisions don't become too stark, that we uphold the values that have enabled us to exist as Chatham House, which are values of liberal democracy, but where we don't try to create this as a wall that then prevents us from having conversation, from cooperating with other systems, and also with think tanks that come from those other systems. And that is the challenge I hope this Tokyo conference can try to break its way through. But it is also a moment where we want to remember the inspiration behind the creation of places like Chatham House and the other think tanks that are gathered here at the Tokyo conference. You know, the only way that the liberal part of the world is able to remain strong at this time of division is, I would argue, starting by making sure that we as countries, as liberal democratic countries, are strong internally. Part of the problem we've had is that in the pursuit of globalization, and by focusing on the global benefits of globalization, whether for our individual countries or for the world as a whole, we've ended up creating divisions and schisms inside our own liberal democratic countries that are now putting them under huge pressure. There are many steps that need to be taken. This is to do with education, this is to do with infrastructure investment, but it's also to do with giving citizens a sense that change is not going to happen too quickly, that change won't happen in a way that exacerbates the bad situation of the losers while simply helping the winners. And I would argue that liberal democratic countries need to think a little bit more about how they also protect their societies from globalization and not simply leave them in the mix in a way that they're unprotected. Now, I think one of the big challenges, a third challenge, is that the United States, which has been the big champion of the liberal order, America first means a more zero-sum approach to international relations. Zero-sum is not what liberal international order is about. At the beginning of an intense strategic competition. And I don't think there's anything we can do about that. This is part of the reality of international affairs for the next 10 years, maybe a lot longer. And therefore the core element here is that in that competition, the liberal world needs to be strong. It needs to stick to its values. To the best of our ability, we need to keep the West together in this process. And recognizing at the same time that our liberal system, in my opinion, is the future. That because we are able to have a system of government that empowers individuals, that freedom is stronger than control, we need to just believe and protect in that power for the long term. And if China changes, great. If it doesn't, we're going to have to live with it. The purpose of the West is to serve as an example, as a beacon, that this is best. Look at us. No one wants to leave our system. Even when we disagree as allies. I don't see China with many allies. I don't see Russia with any allies. I don't see people wanting to imitate that system as individuals. I see governments maybe wanting to imitate the Chinese system. I don't see people protesting in the streets saying we want a system like China's system. Let's be confident about our Western system. But let's not be paranoid, about it. Let's be confident about it, let's protect it, let's defend it, let's promote it. But don't build walls in the process. The Tokyo conference is clearly an opportunity for us to remind ourselves as Western institutions of what we need to do to remain strong at this moment of great uncertainty and transition. So we must commit as a group of institutions that are part of that civil society, part of that free information space that enables democracies to exist. We must commit to protect that separation of powers whenever we see our own governments or governments as part of our community forgetting that commitment and undermining some of those key aspects of what liberal democracies are about. And it is happening. It is happening in democracies around the world. So we must stand up and fight against it. I think countries that rely on the rule of law, which especially the mid-sized countries, like Japan, like Britain, like Germany, like France, the countries here, we need to make sure that multilateral systems of coordination, of rule writing, of transparency are sustained. Because even while some of the big powers like America or others may drift, there needs to be a core of what the rules-based order is in the middle. So how we commit to that will be critical for the future.
So we heard from the three speakers raising issues. Now, having listened to the three speakers and connecting them, there are many things that become visible to us. But before I say anything, I would like to hear what other panelists think, starting with Dr. Rohinton. What did you think, having listened to the three speakers? In this session, what are we aiming at, and what do we have to do? What do we have to work in order to get to where?
I think what we have to do is what we've always been doing, but now we have to be much more explicit about that. When mostly the victors met at Bretton Woods in San Francisco, it was very much to create a world that was interlocked enough that countries would see the value of peace and stability rather than confrontation. And I think that same imperative exists now, is to recognize that it is through cooperation that everyone benefits. And so the point, I think it was Robin that made the point, that America or whoever first creates a zero-sum world, when in fact a liberal world order is not about zero sums, is exactly right. That we have to keep convincing ourselves that by cooperation everyone is better off. Some may be better off than others, but mostly we're all worse off. What do I mean? Coming back to the point I made in the previous session, I think we now have to bring that history and that commitment to rules-based order to areas in which we don't have rules. And let me just give you one or two thoughts from a piece a colleague and I have coming out in Project Syndicate next month, in March. I've said this before and I'll say it again, that just as we have a universal Declaration of Human Rights, we are now at a stage where we need something similar in the area of ethics and technology. That we all need to be on the same plane in a very broad umbrella-like way on why we have new technologies, how they're produced, and to what uses they will be made. And again, I make the analogy with UDHR for three reasons. One, it's often easy to sort of fall into the trap and say, but you know, those folks that we don't agree with will never buy into this. Their values are different. Countries will cheat. All true. That's all been said about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as well. Countries sign on that clearly violate human rights. And my response would be, it's precisely for the populations of those countries that we have a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's oppressed peoples that look up to these very aspirational statements and don't let the fact that not everyone buys into them discourage you from having aspirational statements. And we need one for new technologies. Second, these kinds of aspirational statements actually serve a very pragmatic purpose, which is the framing of national and subnational legislation. There are lots of examples of countries where human rights legislation is driven by the statements in the UDHR. And third, over time, those kinds of statements can actually lead to naming and shaming and even prosecution of violators, as we've seen with the International Criminal Court. So I think having a rules-based order driven by a very values-laden ethical statement about why we have technology and how it is technology that serves society and not the other way around is time. Then there's a series of much more pragmatic, roll-up-your-sleeves kinds of issues on which we need rules. Digital taxation, the governance of data, things I talked about in the previous session to do with the rollout of IP. So let me just stop on that and say there's a huge agenda on which we need various groups to come together. And unlike in 1944 and 45, where you only had victors come together, now we're at a stage where we don't have winners and losers. And we have a forum, the G20, which is ready-made for countries that don't see eye to eye on everything, who meet regularly and to actually talk about these things. And so I think we have the moment, we have the agenda, and we have the forum. And we all have that commitment to make it happen. And we should really devote ourselves to getting there.
Thank you, Kudo-san. And let me start from where Lindsay left off, that where James had some very pithy comments to make about both the world order and the US election. let me step out of my brief and start with the US election. James, I agree completely that the US, and I'm driving at this from the wrong side. That US disengagement, I completely agree with you, from the world and its troubles started long before Trump. No, it has been the accepted US policy for, I think, well over a decade now. And whether you look at Obama's pivot to Asia, whether you look at the concept of the Indo-Pacific, it has been part of a process of disengagement once the US started counting the costs of engagement and found them to be disproportionate. But the problem was, and the problem had been, that every attempt to disengage itself only landed up pushing it deeper and deeper into the morass, deeper and deeper into the quagmire. Now, what Trump has done, Trump has ensured that this disengagement now comes accompanied by this very much in-your-face unilateralism. I don't care what the rest of you think. I'm going to go ahead and do it. Now, gone is the idea of building consensus. You don't need to build a consensus to disengage. If it means throwing your Kurdish allies under the bus in Syria, so be it. If it means striking a deal with the Taliban in Afghanistan, knowing very well that once the US troops withdraw, it is going to be back to business as usual for the Taliban, because there is no one Taliban. They are a group of factional tribals fighting each other. And various interests in the region are going to be using them for their purposes to carry on jihad and all the other fights that they've been used to so far. In the process, yes, trust between nations, trust between allies has been a major casualty. And you very correctly, I think, hinted at it, that can this trust be restored if there's a different presidency in place? I think there are doubts. So, which means that no matter what happens in the forthcoming election, no matter who wins in November, US and many of US allies are going to be left exploring the possibilities of new alliances and new coalitions. And that, in fact, actually makes US disengagement a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because it has started in this manner, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So no matter what the outcome of the forthcoming elections are going to be, we are not going to see the world move back to the pre-2017 era. And since, yes, we are all at a gathering of democracies, let us leave the outcome of the US elections, I totally agree with you, to the citizens of the United States of America, lest Kudo-san be accused of interfering in the US electoral process. But fundamentally what has happened in the last few years, the nature of politics and political engagement across the world has changed. And that is a deep difference. Yes, politics has become far louder, it has become far more strident than it ever was. The tone and tenor has changed. And as I put it yesterday, that if I were to put my finger on the one defining paradox of the present times, we are at that very unique moment in history where we have weak nations, but ruled by strong leaders. Now that is a very difficult paradox to get over. No, more than 2/3 of the richest 100 entities on the planet are no longer countries. They are corporations. Many whose value is based on the ability to collect, refine, connect, all that data which Rohinton was talking about. Talk of Apple, Amazon, Huawei, across the world. It is not just American entities. Across the world. They all have cash in hand which is larger than the GDP of 2/3 of the countries. So while I agree with Rohinton that yes, there has to be, when you start talking of a new Bretton Woods, a new world order, today when you start talking of a new world order, it is not just the G20. You're going to have to start negotiating it with a lot of other stakeholders in the process. When you start talking of the rules of governance, when you start talking of a lot of other issues. Now that is going to be a challenge. So these are, as far as I see, some of when we start constructing a new world order. First of all, countries which believe in the liberal world order, which believe that liberalism is the way to go forward, need initially to start examining what went wrong with the liberal world order. There's a lot of soul searching which liberalism has to do with itself. Now, what led to a position which saw the rise of the kind of leadership you've seen in many parts of Europe today? You've seen a very deeply polarized the United States of America, trying to find answers to the same questions. What went wrong? And liberalism also will need to reinvent itself, needs to rethink. Needs rethink as to what went wrong in 2008. Perhaps the liberal world order had already got captured by an elite, and the people saw a very simple answer. They saw that the world had basically allowed two sets of terrorists to get away free. One set dug deep in the caves of Kandahar. The other continued to party in Davos. It did not make a difference. So liberalism needs to find answers to many of these questions, and these are all questions that the liberal order must grapple with.
Thank you, Kudo-san. Let me, like Sanjoy, try to turn my 10 minutes prepared speech into a 3 minutes comment or so. I think whoever wins the US elections, no, I will do it in 3 minutes, no problem. Whoever wins the US elections, there will be a new challenge for the Europeans and for Japan to step up their efforts and take more responsibility to either maintain what is left of the international order or to reinvigorate it together with a new American president. Of course, the latter choice would be easier, but it would make it more difficult for us to simply hide and sulk and hedge. So let's prepare for that role and ask what kind of international role do we want, do democracies want? Now, you could give a general answer and say the aim is a functioning multilateral order, and everybody seems to agree on that, but let me try to be a little bit provocative here and say that I think what we should aim for is a form of realistic multilateralism. That is an international order based on inclusive institutions and agreed rules, but not normatively overburdened. Differently put, I think we in Europe and in Japan and the United States, we should be very, very clear about our democratic and liberal values, but we should not expect that everybody else subscribes to these values in the foreseeable future. China will certainly not in the foreseeable future, and there are a couple of others who won't, and they still need, even if they don't subscribe to our liberal conception of the world, they still need to be part of that rules-based order, and we must make that possible. So what is important, and I think possible, is agreement on and respect for and compliance with international rules, or put it differently again, I think what I would aim for is international rule of law rather than global liberalism, and that may probably be a bit controversial here. What should democracies do? 3 points I would very, very briefly flag, and I'm finished. I think democracies need to step up to the challenge of China's growing influence, but at the same time take care not to undermine all the economic and technical cooperation that has been built over the last decades. So while it is important to avoid one-sided dependencies, we shouldn't throw interdependency into the bin of history. Interdependency still has a stabilizing effect. It is potentially a peace-building force. And I think we need to engage internationally much more. There are many countries in Asia and in Africa who appreciate China's economic outreach and the Belt and Road, at the same time fearing one-sided dependencies. And here it's upon richer democratic countries like Japan and Europe to step in and to offer alternatives. And we have the instruments for that. We have our EU-Japan connectivity partnership. We have the European Investment Bank with infrastructure funds. We have the Asian Development Bank with infrastructure funds. So we can do a lot to help these countries not to fall into into single dependency on China. At the same time, and here I don't have to repeat what Rohinton says, we have to pragmatically develop new rules and institutions wherever a minimum consensus can be found. And of course, there are things like WTO reform, even though it may not be comprehensive and complete, that could be the beginning of an international regime on data governance. It should be, as the minister said in the previous session, arms control arrangements or at least discussions regarding new technologies like robotics or biotech, which are all sort of militarily usable. And of course, it needs to be global health, as we are seeing these days. And my final recommendation to democracies would be to be very confident in that systemic rivalry. Now, it's true that the Chinese are promoting a model of governance which is different from ours. It's autocratic, non-democratic. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of how attractive democracy, rule of law, checks and balances still are, particularly in countries where they are absent. And I think if you ask yourself why are the Chinese authorities so nervous about Hong Kong, it is because democracy is still very much attractive, and particularly in democratic states, we shouldn't lose sight of that. And that means that particularly when we engage internationally, we shouldn't leave vacuums. We have seen that the United States has been leaving the UN Human Rights Council. China stepped in and is very active in the Human Rights Council, where it tries to redefine the very concept of human rights, a very individualistic concept of human rights. I think we must not leave that happen. We must not leave vacuums in international organizations like the Human Rights Council, like UNESCO and others, but rather actively defend our democratic values where they are challenged. Thank you.
Ambassador Onkenon, what we are discussing is how to achieve a desired international order. How should we work to achieve that? Having heard the three panelists, would you like to share your views?
Thank you, Kudo-san. I fundamentally have no different opinion hearing from the preceding speakers. But at the same time, I feel that while we should continue to promote what we know to be the liberal world order, we are actually giving away a lot of our time and opportunity for those who are subscribing to what we call issues of faith, identities. And this kind of tendency will basically undermine what we seek out to do, which is to have a consistency, a value-based world order. So I would like to take this opportunity to pitch for more attention being paid to the threats to our liberal world order, not so much just based on economic and existing rule of law and other things that we know creating this economic system that we have, multilateral trade system that we have, but actually as our colleague from India has stressed, the strong leaders, and they rely on issue of faith and identity and now civilizational, quote-unquote, aspect to try to play a role in moving away from the liberal world order that we know. And this is very dangerous because in all our nations, whether in America or in Southeast Asian country, ASEAN, or in China, you have, apart from all that thing to do with economic, multilateral cooperation and whatnot, the structure of our respective countries or sovereign nation, a lot depends on how we accommodate each other's beliefs, faith, and move towards mutual coexistence or mutual understanding of the need for coexistence. So we need to do more, and in this respect, I feel that many of the smaller countries in the world, in Southeast Asia, we have ASEAN, and other places, you are now seeing a bit more active cooperation across the African Union. Yeah, and in the South Pacific, I read recently that the Pacific Island states have become more conscious of the need to work together, not so much to disown the liberal world order. They know, they need the rules, they understand they have to be part of international organization and whatnot, but to stress that an important, essential element of the existing world order as we know is how to accommodate each other with regard to what we believe in, how we see our respective faith and our beliefs, and is there a way to stop the extremists and the more cultural, or somebody called it civilizational dimension from taking over. So this is something which some of the bigger nations, maybe like in Japan, is not so well appreciated because you have a rather cohesive and the majority of your people do not have to deal with this kind of potential conflict over beliefs, faith, and identity. Some European countries are also like Japan, but then there are now younger European Union members who have to deal with some of these issues. So going forward, the liberal world order must find a way to accommodate this, because as we become preoccupied with whether it's America first or China first, we lose sight of the other threat to our respective societies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Various issues have been raised. Ambassador Fujisaki, having listened to other speakers, can you give us your thoughts, please? Well, I believe that the important issues have already been raised, but let me just talk about three things. One is about globalism. Deregulation always accompanies globalization. You need to deregulate in order to compete against other countries. So obviously, the heavier players would win. There will be people who are left behind, and Mr. Trump is looking at that, and Mr. Sanders is also looking at that. So in the election, Mr. Sanders is doing the same thing as Mr. Trump. He's looking at student loans. University of Tokyo costs 500,000 yen per year. Harvard is 5 million. It's the same with Columbia University. Obviously, many students would have to take out student loans. So making it free of charge university education, obviously you can garner more votes. And Mr. Trump, in 2016, when he ran for office, if he does everything he promised, nobody can win, because that is not rational. But nobody makes that calculation, and he won. He leverages that. In the case of Japan, drug prices, universal health coverage, taxation, public and national universities, because of these systems, we have the systems in place. So the disparity in the society is not that marked. We have a model here. I think we can say that we have a more egalitarian system here. Now, multilateralism. Multilateralism worked well for us in Japan. When WTO came up with multilateralism, there was 36 members. Right now, it's 164. the system didn't anticipate countries like China joining. So buffet in hotel is all you can eat at the same price. Let's say 5,000 yen or 10,000 yen. You pay that amount and you can eat all you want. But let's say a sumo wrestler comes into the buffet. Sumo champion comes in. And if that wrestler says that this is all you can eat, and because they are from a developing nation, they have a doggy bag with them to bring back the food, the system is not going to hold. So this is called cherry picking. And that is why the system is now being eroded. State-owned enterprises, intellectual property rights, you need to let them play on the level playing field. Maybe charge them more in certain instances to maintain the system. This is not just Mr. Trump's doing. He sounded the alarm. And because of that, we are in a position to be making an adjustment. Because if we kept the same system for another 30 years, this could have been in a total mess. Lastly, U.S.-China confrontation. If you ask many Americans, they say that this is going to continue. This is not just limited to trade. Communications, military, this is the conventional wisdom of Americans. But is this really true? I think you need to think about this. Right now is in the election cycle, so everybody is taking a very hardline position against the Chinese in order to win in the election. But if Mr. Trump is replaced, think about this. Mr. Obama denied everything Bush did, and Trump denied everything Obama did. The next president, would you believe that the next president is going to follow the line of Mr. Trump? Things could change. And this coronavirus in China, Hong Kong, U.S.-China confrontation, China may be hitting against a wall. So there's a chance that they may change. So I believe what is important is that for Japan, we should not think that this confrontation will continue forever. I don't know whether Xi Jinping will be coming to Japan, but I think it's very important for Japan to maintain the position to accept both U.S. and China.
Thank you very much. Lots of comments were made. If I may, I would like to sort of reorganize and invite American panelist and Mr. Nakao. I will invite comments, but let me reorganize. Ambassador Fujisaki, your comment was very clear and it was fundamental. One point. First of all, about the United States, as Mr. Lindsay mentioned, I was assured, or I understood, I agree that to make a global system and to implement and operate, the cost cannot be borne alone by the United States. There should not be free riders, but there must be commensurate burdening by stakeholders. I think this is an important issue in the order establishment going forward. In the process, the EU members, they contribute more in the defense spending, and Japan's defense spending is also expanding. How much burden, cost will have to be borne? That is not certain. The public goods, international public goods, going forward, the countries who take the global leadership, if they all share in making the global goods, about the designs and the systems, all that have to be considered. So based on the United States, the US-based system is maintained and valued, but free riding will not be sustainable. All stakeholders will have to burden commensurate cost. So with what process, how long would it take to stabilize? That is what we would like to know. Yes, as Josh mentioned, US takes a unilateral approach, no effort to reach consensus. So from the very beginning, consensus is not the target. That if only to ask others to bear the cost, then it would be very difficult to operate this international liberal order. The allies want to work together with the United States, but that would not be operational. So in this aspect, what has to be considered about the free rider, the issue is China as well. China is indeed free riding. The WTO, when they acceded to the WTO, they claimed that they were a developing state. Looking at the domestic circumstances, indeed, there's lots of disparity, inequality inside China, but not only just free riding, but leveraging that status of a developing country. They steal technology, for example, to not allow the free riding based on a full reciprocity, mutualism. Rules must be complied by China. If China cannot accommodate reciprocity or mutualism, then on our side, we have to demand mutualism or reciprocity. We are not going to jump to that situation immediately, but rather than free riding, that there must be commensurate sharing of the burden or the cost, and in that way, how could we think about the exit? I would like to invite the American experts for their comments about the democracies on our side. Indeed, digital taxation and other rules have to be made. And within the context of globalization, there is a disparity or people stuck in poverty. We are aware that we also need to take actions. Efforts are being made. So I believe such efforts will continue. But what Robin mentioned, he was correct. Countries like democracies, do they see that democracies are functioning? If democracy is functioning in the decision-making process, competitive edge might be lost. So that's what Josh mentioned, that it's not a very good environment. All countries seek dictatorial, powerful, high-handed leadership. So from democracies, those elected persons, they turn into authoritarian dictatorship. How to interpret this phenomena? I think there's a similar underlying issue. A strong democracy, how to make a strong democracy, strong in the sense of decision making and within the context of globalization, for democracies to become power, to have more power, what could be done? I think that was implied in Robin's message. So on those two aspects, I think efforts are required. So I would like to seek your observation. Mr. Nakao, what you told us, I think it was all linked. So I would also like to invite Mr. Nakao, but first of all, Mr. Lindsay, Paul, first of all from the United States, please, and then may I ask Mr. Nakao, representing a democracy. So 3 minutes each, please.
Okay.
No, 3 minutes.
I'd like to take a little different direction because I think we're talking about the liberal world order and states and democracies. In my world, we talk about companies and data and some of the sort of a different perspective. And I think we also talk about NGOs and other sort of non-government organizations and the key role they play in both driving technology forward and supporting democracy. So a good example I think is AI. So for example, in the world now we have general agreement on things like AI ethics, right? Everybody agrees that AI should be human-centric, et cetera. But we're now sort of at a point of trying to implement actual regulatory issues around AI. And so how is that happening in different parts of the world? Well, in Europe, you have a very nice public-private partnership. The high-level experts group on AI has drafted a very good set of recommendations for two purposes. One is to integrate those recommendations into the actual company practice of developing AI algorithms so that they represent proper values, EU values, if you will. And then the second one is to develop a basis for regulation of this very fast emerging technology which is affecting all of our lives, right? So but in the Europeans are very much want to regulate, but they're way ahead in terms of thinking about how to do that. at a very high level, and it's very sophisticated. In the US, we have a different approach, which has been sort of non-government organizations under the Partnership for AI, for example. A number of our clients are part of that big US tech companies that, as one of our guests said, control a lot of the data. And so that is a very sort of grassroots effort. It's designed to develop policies and inform policymakers about how to regulate things, but there's no government direct role in that. But that group very quickly has run into some interesting problems with China because it aspires to be a more global player. So there are members, for example, of the partnership in Europe and other places, but there's been a big dispute over China. Should you admit big Chinese companies like Baidu and Alibaba and Tencent, which are the counterparts of Google and Facebook on the US side? And 2 years ago, the partnership actually allowed Baidu to become a member, and this drew a huge response internally because it's a very democratic organization from human rights groups, because they were very concerned about China's human rights record. So, but I think it's still the general consensus is you don't want to, because AI is a global project, and because Chinese companies, for example, are such huge players, that you want to bring the Chinese companies into the discussion around ethics and regulation rather than leave them out. The question is still how to do that. And so now we're at a moment where, for example, the Europeans would like to begin regulating probably facial recognition, and some applications of facial recognition will be the first area of application or regulation. And then the question is, okay, if some rules are established in Europe, what does China do? Because China is using, Chinese companies are supporting the Chinese government in using facial recognition in ways to monitor populations, and in ways, again, that are viewed in the West as not very, as inimical to Western values. So I think it'll be a really interesting situation going forward where the regulatory issues around, coming from the bottom up in Europe with very, very public-private partnerships are driving that process. And then, again, the critical issue will be how to bring China and Chinese companies into this. At present, there's no dialogue, for example, between the U.S. government and China on AI issues or AI regulatory issues, nor between the EU and China. But at some point, there's going to be a need for a trilateral effort on this among the three big players in this particular technology space to develop a new approach to this. So I think when we think about new organizations and new approaches, sometimes I think things coming from the ground up may be more appropriate because as soon as you start talking about AI, you're right away into the data realm too, and you're going to need to be able to figure out how you deal with data crossing borders and AI training data sets. And the Europeans, for example, the last thing I'll say is they're thinking that they may only allow, for example, AI algorithms in Europe that were trained under data rules that the Europeans agree with. So that's the world we're moving into, and I think that's going to help drive the discussion at the government level about how to be part of that and make sure that the Western liberal order is and that its values are represented.
Listening to the discussion on this panel for the last few minutes has reminded me why I love coming to the Tokyo conference, because I think a lot of really smart things have been said, and I hope people in the audience and watching on tape take to heart I think the real terrific insights that have been laid out today. I want to make sort of two quick points. One is just to flag a point that Robin Niblett of Chatham House made in his videotape remarks, which is that the U.S.-China strategic competition is likely to last for quite some time. And I think to talk about a landing zone or an exit for that is to misunderstand the nature of the competition. However, and I would go a bit further, I think it's important to understand that the United States response is going to be a mixture of engagement and contestation. And I think it needs to be. And I'll just note that, and I'm glad Paul is here, because Paul and Rohinton have offered up a number of places where there is real opportunity to find common ground. When you look in the economic sphere, there are many places in which you can argue about the rules, and one set of rules may favor one side a little bit more than the other, but a lot of this is negotiable. you can cut a deal. And I think the challenge for policymakers is to keep those things in mind and look for not a landing zone or an exit, but multiple exits, multiple landing zones, because there's going to have to be lots of different deals that are done. But I think at the same time, we need in our conversation be guided by the recognition that some things simply can't be sliced up. Our values simply can't be negotiated away. I really appreciate Ambassador Ong's observation about the importance of civility and tolerance in tamping down on the underside of human passions and how it manifests itself in the world. And I'll just offer one example, and I think it's fundamental to understand that the attitudes of China are in many ways antithetical to those core values. Over the last couple months ago, the general manager of the Houston Rockets sent out a single tweet critical or supportive of the Uyghurs, and that of Hong Kong, Hong Kong, and that led the Chinese government to crack down and basically apply very overt pressure on the NBA. This example has been multiplied a number of times over, and this is a significant threat, and I think it's something that we have to recognize and deal with. Don't have a simple answer, but it is a real problem. Second point I want to make is that President Trump, whether you like his policies or not, likes the way he approached his foreign policy or not, has reminded American policymakers of one important thing, and that is sometimes you need to raise your voice and bang the table to get people's attention. And we've had side conversations during the conference about some of the examples. But if you think, for example, the Iran nuclear deal, or you think about the WTO, or you think about defense spending in NATO, when the President of the United States made clear his unhappiness and he was willing to go a different way, one of the consequences was suddenly America's closest allies became much more interested in finding common ground. Now, I think in the case of the Trump administration, he was unable to take yes for an answer on a number of these issues. My great fear is that if a Democrat comes into office, what will happen is they will not be willing to bang the table and raise the voice. And as a consequence of that, many of America's friends and allies will feel that the pressure is off and they won't really need to do anything, and things can go back the way they are. And I think that would be a fundamental mistake, because that will sort of accelerate the erosion of this order that we're all talking about.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to say that the dichotomy between the liberal economic order or liberal political order versus authoritarian regime is, I would say, too much, because many countries have different situations, and we need to look at why these countries become more authoritarian and what is the nature of China, for instance. First, China is, in a sense, very special because their economic system is market economy, and their political system is socialist. Although they gave up the communist ideas of the central control and also total ownership of public things is over, but they still keep the one-party system. But they already moved to the market economy, and they face a lot of challenges because of social media and so on. They cannot be totally different from other countries in one way, and they want to be a part of international rule or order. If we look at the climate change, they are part of Paris Club, and they also are part of the quality infrastructure principle, which was adopted in G20 last year, which means they must adhere to the burden of countries, the sustainability of foreign countries and the environmental and social impact of the projects. So they are not trying to be different from others. They want to be a part of international order, although there are so many differences. And another point is that many countries have become more authoritarian, like the developing countries of Asia, because compared to China, they cannot deliver infrastructure project and others because of so many litigations, so many kind of processes and so on. So they want to be more efficient. That is one point. And also, some countries like Central Asia, they are faced with a lot of challenges from terrorist intrusions from Afghanistan and so on. So unless they keep a very strong unity in the countries, if they let the NGO and others speak out or do something freely, it might mean the intrusion of terrorist kind of movement. So we should understand why those countries become more kind of authoritarians in a way, or they at least keep that kind of system. And the third point is that in many countries, why we are now losing a kind of power in liberal order, partly because of the political move of countries like the United States or Brexit or Europe and so on. And it is because there is once again, very strong feeling of a resentment and also disappointment about the kind of the globalizations and unity like Euro or EU. And we should carefully, seriously look at those things. Unless we understand why it happens, we cannot address these issues of the change of political and economic order. There are quickly three things to do, and one is we should once again look at the economic inequalities of countries, and we should have taxations and data and platform enterprises should be addressed. And I mentioned I went to China 16 times during my presidency of 7 years, and I mentioned also to China that they should do more about redistributions within the countries instead of trying to, in a sense, the project their power to outside. They must address their own equalities of food cost systems and taxation and so on. The second point is how we can continue to include the U.S. as a leader of the international system. And I think it is so important to make U.S. continue to play a role, and we should also share some more burdens. But at the same time, we must convince the United States that the leaders in the international system is not just for others, like a charity, but it is to the interest of the U.S. also. And the third point is about liberal kind of Gendron or freedom of speeches. And this kind of discussion is so important. We should still continue to say that the liberal order, freedom of speeches, and professional ideas by the scholars, intellectuals, those are so important, and we shouldn't give up. Human rights and democracy, those things shouldn't be given up.
Volker, maybe as a democracy, the democracies of our own countries will have to be strengthened. First, I would like to ask your opinion. And there are other questions. That is, in Asia, China and cooperation with China is done in different forms, but deterrence over China has to be strengthened. Otherwise, in the Senkaku Island, China's public ships are entering, government ships are increasing. It is a record high number of Chinese official vessels in the Senkaku Island area. So whilst we cooperate, there must be stronger deterrence against China. In the case of Europe, what is your observation and feeling vis-à-vis China? How to check the rising power of China? What activities are done in Europe? So this is a question to Volker.
Thank you, Kudo-san. It's two questions, actually. The one on the state of democracy and the other on European view of how to deal with or even deter China. I think when we speak about democracy and authoritarianism, we shouldn't leave out the gray zone in between. It's not only black and white, not only democracy and authoritarianism. And I think particularly if we speak about the possibility or the real chance of President Trump being re-elected, he is neither a liberal Democrat nor is he an authoritarian leader. He is what Viktor Orban, the Hungarian leader, would call an illiberal Democrat. He has been democratically elected, but he's certainly not liberal. I don't know, he would defend democracy, but I think, and here I'm blatantly intervening into the American elections, that if he is re-elected, that will be bad for liberal democracy in the world, because after 4 years, American voters this time know exactly what they get. 4 years ago, they may have been excused for not knowing what they get. Now they know what they get, and if he is re-elected, it will be a signal to Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, to Viktor Orban in Hungary, to Bolsonaro in Brazil, that with a policy mix of populism, illiberalism, nationalism, and tempering, more importantly, and tempering with your own constitution, tempering with checks and balances, you have a recipe for success even in democratic countries. And that, I think, is dangerous. That doesn't mean that democracy would be abolished in these countries, but we would have a stronger tendency towards this kind of illiberal majoritarian democracy rather than liberal democracy with checks and balances in a couple of countries, including some countries in the European Union, Poland, Hungary, probably others, some countries like Turkey and Brazil, where we already see it, but probably also in some ASEAN countries, probably even in some of the established democracies of Asia. And therefore, I think it is the question who wins the elections in the United States is not just an internal question, it's a question that is important for all of us in the world. What do we do about China? I have 1 minute left, or a little bit less. I think what we need to realize is that Europe has just started 2-3 years ago to think about China in strategic terms. Before that, we also did criticize China and Chinese practices and policies for not allowing a level playing field for European companies, for example, or stealing company secrets. But we didn't think about the strategic dimension very much. We are starting to think about that. There is a dimension of as we said, systemic rivalry in terms of China supporting authoritarian models of governance. But there is also something which we didn't speak about here, that is China. I mean, you mentioned, Jim, the NBA issue. China trying to censor the debate about China in democratic countries. Ask the Swedes, they have quite a story about how China deals with foreign countries, foreign diplomats who have an opinion on what happens in China. Ask about what professors who probably cooperate with the Confucius Institute in Germany or in Spain or in Austria have to deal with once they have a critical view of China. So I think Europe is getting more aware, but forgive us for sort of seeing strategic dangers to Europe, not so much in the Senkaku Islands as rather in the Baltic Sea. So there is another big country out there which concerns Europeans more in terms of deterrence, as you mentioned, than China does. But we totally understand the Japanese position that wants, on the one hand, as we heard from the minister, not cut economic relations with China, but at the same time wants to have a strong deterrence.
Now, there is also a question asked of Dr. Rohinton Medora as well. So the question to Rohinton would be, rules making is often said, but how to protect the liberal order? What kind of rules should be given priority? How to prioritize when you say rules making? So this is a question to you, Rohinton. But there is another question I would also like to ask of you about the management of data. Now, in relation to the personal data, trying to chain in the data, just like Europe is trying to do. But China, they're trying to isolate totally. And the US style of approach. Japan is wondering which approach would be the best. For the personal data and data management, how should we make the rules? What is your view? So if you could also answer to this question as well, Rohinton, please.
Yeah, so I mean, on Volker's last point, I'd add Canada to the list. We know a thing or two increasingly about what it means to be on the wrong side of China as well. the question, but I think we're too, I'm not naive enough to think that in foreign policy, consistency is the golden rule. I understand that one deviates, but I do think that focusing only on China's illiberalism and faults sort of misses many other points. The two that I'd flag would be that, you know, banging on a table to expect your allies to do more would carry more weight, except that there's no banging whatsoever in areas like Saudi Arabia and Russia. So, I mean, I'm not saying everything has to be consistent, but I do think the US position would be more credible if the banging on the table was a bit more uniform and you didn't sort of treat Canadian steel as a national defense threat and not have a thing to say about Russian interference in US elections. So, you know, we've gone so far the other way in terms of inconsistency that I do think I worry about rules-based orders whatsoever. And so then the question becomes data. First of all, I'd make the point that the Chinese system and the US systems, when it comes to data, are not that dissimilar. Because in both cases, the citizen is disempowered. In the one case, in the Chinese sphere, the citizen cedes control over data to a state that is both omnipresent and supposed to be acting only in the public interest, which is clearly a naive way of looking at it. In the US case, it's similar. I mean, the citizen is just as disempowered. We also tick on things when we enter websites without knowing what we're ticking on in terms of giving permission. But it happens to be large firms, the ones that Sanjay actually wants at the table in multi-stakeholder processes, who largely control the data. And so in Europe, and some would say it's because Europe doesn't have data champions, multinational data champions, the GDPR sort of privileges the citizen in ways that haven't fully been fleshed out, and so there's a review of GDPR that's just begun. But I think a good starting point would be the European system. I really think that this is one case where the classic liberal order is best served by saying, this is a start. Now, to what extent can we have exceptions? To what extent can we have, just as we had special and differential treatment in the GATT, what is the equivalent of that? What is the equivalent of saying that tariffs in the presence of a balance of payments crisis might be okay? And so there's ways that we have to start with the lighthouse. The goalpost is citizens control their data. And then you say, what might be the exceptions and why? And then have that system imperfectly evolve over time. But since I've run out, I could wax eloquent, but I won't.
For the last question, Mr. Lindsay. A question to Mr. Lindsay, Dr. Lindsay. The presidential election also has this problem. The multinational American enterprises are very strong across the world, particularly in the area of digital technology. And digital taxation is also a matter related to that. These multinationals, they are becoming stronger in the global market and causing disparity in equality. Also, in the financial institutions, there are such giant multinationals, but there are extremely rich people and extremely abjectly poor people in the United States. So what is the United States going to do in the presidential election? Is this an issue? And I think it is becoming an issue in the election, not only about the ideological way of thinking, but the economic cost, the global multinationals, but the disparity inside the country. Mr. Lindsay, there was a question from the audience for you.
Well, thank you for the question. I will note that today I'm being asked to opine on things in which I have no great expertise. Since I was talking about the coronavirus, I will talk about inequality in the United States. I think if you look at the current debate in the United States, particularly in the Democratic Party, if I could point to one issue that I would put at the top, it would be the issue of inequality. And I think if you look at Senator Sanders, who has done the best in the first of first three nominating events, that's his fundamental critique, that the American system is not working for the American people. It is working for a small few, for the billionaire class, I think how we would put it. I think Senator Warren of my home state, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, has made a similar, not identical, but similar argument. Now, I don't know how the Democratic primary is going to play out, but I think this is obviously an issue that whoever the Democratic candidate is come November is going to make the case that the United States has tilted too far in one direction and people have been left behind and need to be taken care of. Now, in a way, if you think of it, and someone, I think Ambassador Fujisaki made this point, that Donald Trump made somewhat the same argument back in 2016, that he was going to look after forgotten people. Now, we can get into an argument, probably here is not the best place, as to whether the president's policies have effectively advanced the case of, or situation of the coal miner in West Virginia, or the manufacturing worker in Ohio, or the farmer in Iowa, and we can have that argument. But I think at least the rhetoric in the debate is focused on that. A big question, which fortunately I don't have the answer, is what are the actual policies at the end of the day that will resolve or reverse the inequalities? If you look at sort of inequality in the United States, it has reached levels we haven't seen since the 1920s, and that's a demonstrable fact. It's not at all clear, though, what the policies are that will reverse that on a sustainable basis. But we're about to have, I think, a very vigorous presidential season in which I think these issues are going to get a fair amount of airtime.
Yes, thank you. Understood. We have already run out of the time. The attempt that we have been engaged in, as we have been discussing since yesterday, in the unstable order we see right now, we would like to raise a question to the society. That is the very purpose of this conference. So, for the latter half of this session, I believe we have had a good discussion, more than I have anticipated. So based upon the discussion we had today, we would like to present our message to the G7 presidency, as well as to the whole of the world. If we could have done that today, then it would have been better. But I am rather concerned and worried that some people may find it difficult to perhaps depart late. But I very much like to have the discussion tomorrow. The first and foremost, what I'm worried about would be the United States, who would be in the presidency for G7 this year. And there will be a representative from the American embassy tomorrow, and we will be handing our statement to the person. And because of the very difficult coronavirus outbreak, I would like to thank all of you in the audience for coming despite of the difficulty, and that we would like to take on squarely the debate on this, how to create and maintain the international liberal order. That we have this discussion and continue to have discussion is something of an important message that we need to send out to the whole of the world. Because all of you are in the audience, we were able to have this good discussion. Baseball game without any spectators would be boring and not really fun. So thank you very much to the audience. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Now, lastly, we would like to have the closing address. A closing address will be given by Ambassador Fujisaki, the former Japanese ambassador to the United States. If you could come to the podium, please. I should be very, very brief. Just 3 points. Democracy and rule-based system, that it is in a critical situation. From 5 years or so ago, Mr. Kudo started to say these things, and I was wondering why he was saying these things, but that's because Emmanuel Todd and Kudo were the only ones who were worried about these things, but it is now a global trend. So they were quite insightful. But now there are many questions being raised, so we need to dig even deeper. The foreign panelists who we have seen today, they were actually being criticized in their own home countries. Why are you going to Japan? So they are very courageous and very brave people. So thank you very much. And we would like to thank them with a big applause. And lastly, all of you in the audience, you were also very courageous. So in order to appreciate your courage, I have suggested to Mr. Kudo that 3 years' worth of membership a fee should be waived. But because of the financial situation of Gendon NPO, he cannot really do that. But in any case, we would like to express our appreciation. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Fujisaki. So this is the end of Tokyo Conference organized by Gendon NPO. Once again, a big applause to all the speakers, please.